It's developing a multi-year plan to address where SAEM can uniquely support dynamic changes in the workforce. We have over 75 members who have volunteered to serve on this committee and will work on topics such as the scope of practice, evidence-based value proposition of EM training, and ensuring our EM pipeline remains robust and diverse. We know that diverse teams are more innovative and successful, and I am proud of SAEM's commitment to intentionality, to diversity within the work that we do on the board, the implicit bias training required of all of our organization's leaders and for our academies, committees, and interest groups, including ADIEM, AWEM, our SAEM Equity and Inclusion Committee, and all those being deliberate in advancing diversity and inclusion within SAEM and as a specialty. Our success will go as far as our members allow, and I think, and I know, and I ask that we all bring this intentionality to our work. When we think about diversity and inclusion, an important aspect is to review the data. We've started collecting some self-identified demographic data on our membership. Here, you can see some data gathered before SAEM24 demonstrating the percentages of members who identify as female and underrepresented in medicine. SAEM also collects and evaluates data on our SAEM awardees, our grant recipients, our board of directors, our committee chairs, our academic executive committee, our academy executive committee, and SAEM staff. To make these data even more robust, we ask that you complete your demographics here while at SAEM24. You can do this simply by clicking the virtual bag button on the bottom row of the meeting app homepage and then clicking SAEM demographics. It just takes a second, and we need those data. SAEM is the premier organization for developing and supporting academic leaders. In response to you, our members, we have developed faculty development programs across the spectrum from residents to fellows, the residents and fellows who have just graduated, to senior faculty ready to become chairs. At the SAEM headquarters in Chicago, we've expanded into new state-of-the-art educational spaces to bring learners together with experienced mentors to lay the foundation for the future of academic emergency medicine. We offer courses to support our members' professional development, whether to become a stronger researcher in ARMED or ARMED Med Ed, or a more effective leader in the eLead, CIMA, and CDP courses. Our resident and medical student, or RAMS group, representing the largest section of our membership, is unbelievable, and they inspire me daily. In addition to contributing to the work that our academies, our committees, and interest groups do, they've worked on numerous initiatives throughout the past year, including collaborating with the other emergency medicine resident and student organizations, developing new career roadmaps for several fellowship paths, their Ask a Chair podcast, and their many tremendous offerings this week here at SAEM24. Nice work, Rams. As educators, we strive for both innovation and high-quality standardization of education in a highly complex specialty. As an association, I'm so proud of our education journal, Academic Emergency Medicine Education and Training. Under the leadership of Editor-in-Chief Dr. Susan Promise and the AEM ENT Board, we have substantially increased the number of high-quality education papers being published and now have an official impact factor of 1.8. Nice job, Dr. Promise. In addition, through the leadership of our clerkship directors in Emergency Medicine Academy, CDEM, we continue to lead in multiple aspects of our residency application process and advise our students in all sorts of areas, such as away rotations. They do amazing work as well. In terms of research at SAEM, we are proud to increase the impact, the productivity, the implementation, and the visibility of our work across the spectrum of emergency medicine research. Congratulations to our Academic Emergency Medicine Editorial Board and Editor-in-Chief Dr. Jeff Klein. Under his leadership, wait, let me get to the number. The impact factor of our AEM journal has risen to an impressive 4.4. Nice job, Jeff. We've also published SAEM Grace 3 on acute dizziness and vertigo in the ED and launched our newest clinical guideline, SAEM Grace 4, which is going to focus on alcohol use disorder and cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome management in the emergency department. The SAEM Foundation is our specialty's largest foundation, making the most significant research investment in academic emergency medicine's future, empowering our members, saving lives, and improving patient outcomes everywhere. Our foundation has built a $12 million endowment and awarded over $970,000 in grants just this last year, more than ever. We've had a significant increase in donations, especially from you, from our members. I want to express our deepest thanks to everyone who has donated and invested in the most prominent educators and researchers in emergency medicine. Thank you for all that you've given. We have an absolutely fantastic week planned in Phoenix with almost 4,000 of us here and, as Dr. LaFollette mentioned, our largest meeting ever. I want to give special thanks to you, Dr. LaFollette, our program committee chair, and the entire program committee for putting together an absolutely incredible conference with our keynotes, our didactics, our abstracts, our residency and fellowship fair, our master scholars, our program officer event, and so much more. SAEM is shaping the future of emergency medicine science, education, and practice, and I am just so proud and excited to be your president this year. Thank you for entrusting me with this incredible opportunity and responsibility. The SAEM Foundation has made amazing and tremendous strides in developing emergency care researchers and expert educators. A little history lesson. In 2018, under the thoughtful leadership of then SAEM President Dr. Mark Courtney and the SAEM past President and Foundation Chair, Dr. Andra Blomkans, the SAEM Board of Directors and the SAEM Foundation Board of Trustees made a pivotal decision to transform the governance of the foundation and create a new Board of Trustees separate from the SAEM Board of Directors and removing the slotted seat of the SAEM past president to automatically become the SAEM Foundation Chair, and also removing the votes of the SAEM Executive Committee members. It was a huge change. Dr. Mark Courtney gave up his own seat as chair of the foundation in order to give the foundation its own leadership structure, with trustees who would dedicate 100% of their time and their volunteer hours to serve the mission of the SAEM Foundation. These selfless decisions, with the support of the SAEM Board of Directors, launched a new SAEM Foundation Board of Trustees that was more specialized in their interests and newly focused. This new board structure allowed the Foundation Board of Trustees to achieve rapid growth with a series of decisions that would catapult the foundation into a new era. As a first step, the new Board of Trustees conducted a third-party-led feasibility study to evaluate the resources and capacity of the foundation, and then responded to the outcomes with tangible goals and strategies to achieve the milestones set forth in their new strategic plan. With this new plan, the SAEM Foundation grew dramatically, becoming the largest foundation in emergency care research. With expanded staff and newly formed volunteer committees, fundraising and development grew from less than $80,000 a year to over $600,000 per year, and their endowment grew to over $12 million. In just the last year, they've awarded nearly $1 million in research and education grants to SAEM members, supporting our collective mission to improve patient care by investing in the career development of academic emergency physicians, researchers, and educators. Members of SAEM have never been more invested in the foundation than they are today, creating fundraising competitions, a new resident reviewer program, and engaging other foundations and industry partners in the foundation's mission and vision. The recently formed Legacy Society has 15 members. The Legacy Society, I didn't mean to stutter over it, has 15 members who have chosen to leave a portion of their estate with the SAEM Foundation, demonstrating this organization's impact on individual members and the specialty. With all of this in mind, the SAEM Board of Directors is doing something unique. We'd like to proudly select the past and the current presidents of the SAEM Foundation Board of Trustees who have led under this newly defined and successful leadership structure to become the collective recipients of the 2024 SAEM Organizational Advancement Award. As my very first act as SAEM president, it's my pleasure to recognize Drs. Scott Van Epps, Manish Shah, Adrian Tyndall, Brian Zink, Greg Velturo, Michelle Blonda, and Cherry Obgood as the recipients of the SAEM Organizational Advancement Award. I would like to congratulate all of you on behalf of the Society and its over 9,300 members for your remarkable contributions to the organization and the specialty. And don't leave the stage. I'll be right over there for a picture. Congratulations, Brian. Congratulations. Congratulations, Giselle. Don't go anywhere. We're going to get a picture. Hey, congratulations, Jerry. Let's get a picture real quick. Come on. Can you get us all? Yeah. Okay, here we go. Thank you. Don't go anywhere. Don't go anywhere. Don't go anywhere. Don't go anywhere. Before you leave the stage, I've got one more announcement. Because of the transformative leadership and outcomes achieved by the SAEM Foundation and in honor of SAEM's 35th anniversary, on behalf of the SAEM Board of Directors and, again, I just love this number, our 9,300 members, I am proud to present the SAEM Foundation with a donation from the Society of Academic Emergency Medicine in the amount of $1 million. You're supposed to come out. We know that you're going to use this gift to launch SAMF into the next era and invest in more academicians in our specialty. Wait. Ryan's supposed to get in here. Get in here, Ryan. Get in the picture. Wendy, come on. Yeah,
Really awesome, guys.
we just wanted a big
SAEM
check.
Foundation is improving health by investing in academic emergency medicine, career development, research, and education. We invest in science, innovation, and future leaders.
The academicians we support dedicate their lives to finding solutions.
With SAEM Foundation funding, we've partnered with the National Ambulance Service of Ghana to create a telemedicine and medication delivery service to reach ill children in time.
Through clinical, translational, and medical education research, we are truly investing in our future leaders.
My SAEM Foundation funding will help us understand the values and priorities in the residency selection process as we look toward CBME.
We must come together to teach, guide, and invest in ourselves and the next generation.
This is our responsibility.
The time is now.
This is our responsibility.
The time is now.
Let's take the next step to transform emergency care together.
While it's up on the screen, I encourage everyone to take out your phones, become a donor, and help the Foundation continue to launch academic emergency medicine careers and further critical research around the globe. Nice work, Foundation. All yours.
Congratulations, everybody. On that fantastic note, let's keep the momentum going with our Dr. Peter Rosen Memorial Keynote Address. This year's address will be given by Dr. Robert Newmar. Dr. Newmar serves as professor and chair of emergency medicine at the University of Michigan, with over 3 decades of basic and translational research experience and current co-chair of the International Liaison Committee of Resuscitation. He has expanded our specialty in the depth and breadth of academic emergency medicine's reach. In addition, he's been a mentor to a multitude of medical students, doctoral candidates, postdoctoral fellows, and NIH K Award recipients. A leading advocate for federally funded research in emergency care and a passionate voice for increasing the number of investigators in EM, Dr. Newmar has dedicated his career to advancing academic emergency medicine. Please welcome Dr. Newmar.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction. I'm incredibly honored to give the Peter Rosen Memorial Lecture here today. The title of my lecture is Emergency Medicine Research, Past, Present, and Future. I have no financial disclosures as defined by the CME guidelines of the conference, but I do have research funding from NIH, Department of Defense, and the American Heart Association, and I will talk about one of those grants today. So like many of you, photography is one of my hobbies, and I especially like to capture sunrises and sunsets, none of which are the same. They represent the most dynamic time of day when you can actually appreciate the Earth's motion relative to the sun. And fascinatingly, when looking at a single snapshot, it's difficult to distinguish whether the sun is rising or setting. And I believe this is a good analogy for where we are in emergency medicine research today. Some may argue that we are facing a sunset, with too many other challenges requiring our time and resources, such as ED crowding, declining clinical margins, physician burnout, and a reduced medical student interest in our specialty. However, I believe, and I will try to convince you today, that the sun is still rising based on the dynamic growth of our research workforce, infrastructure, funding, and impact, and I believe the best is yet to come. Research is the core mission of any medical specialty, and the mission is fulfilled by creating new knowledge to improve patient care and outcomes. If we don't fulfill our research mission, we will fail our patients, and we will fail as a specialty. We cannot rely on others outside of emergency medicine to optimize the care of the patients we see every day. It will never be their priority. And while collaborative partnerships are essential, we as emergency physicians are uniquely positioned to drive the innovation in emergency care through scientific discovery. Understanding our past, critically assessing our current state, and visioning for our future will all be keys to our success. But that's a lot to cover in one lecture, and I can't cover everything, so I'm going to talk about what I'm not going to talk about. I'm not going to talk about all the great research that has been done over the past decades by EM investigators. That work speaks for itself and has significantly impacted our practice and improved our outcomes. I'm also not going to give or propose a list of research priorities for the specialty because they would be obsolete before they could be even implemented. But what I am going to talk about is building and sustaining the infrastructure, resources, workforce, and culture within our specialty that we need to fulfill our research mission. So let's start from the beginning, and I'll tell you, the beginning was hard. Even one of the founding fathers of our specialty and the namesake for this lecture was skeptical. In his 1979 paper entitled The Biology of Emergency Medicine, Peter Rosen gave his reflections on EM research in the early days of our specialty. He said, emergency medicine is yet to define to anyone's satisfaction its research goals. In terms of basic science research, he said, I do believe there's much basic laboratory research pertinent to our field, and given the time and support, we will have a much easier time demonstrating our own unique biology. And he was a little bit more optimistic about clinical research. He said, unquestionably, there's great room for viable clinical research, and inroads have been made. Based on available data, the first EM faculty member to ever have an NIH R01 grant was Blaine White in 1988 at Wayne State University, who was doing basic science research on the mechanisms of ischemic brain injury. And at that time, NIH didn't even recognize emergency medicine as a departmental category. On a personal note, I actually sought out Dr. White after my emergency medicine residency to be a research mentor. And this photo is of the two of us in 1995 on the day I submitted my first NIH K08 grant. And you can see it's in a large box with 30 hard copies. And we had to go to FedEx to ship it so it would get there overnight on the deadline. And I will note that even at this time, we are still doing research projects that were envisioned by Dr. White before the turn of the century. The next significant advance in EM research came at the turn of the century with the establishment of several federally funded clinical research networks. These include the Pediatric Emergency Care Applied Research Network, or PECARN, in 2001, the Resuscitation Outcomes Consortium in 2004, and the Neurologic Emergencies Treatment Trial Network in 2005, the latter of two which have subsequently merged into the SIREN Research Network. These networks permanently established a much-needed clinical infrastructure research infrastructure for our specialty. But perhaps the most pivotal moment in our research history occurred in 2006, when the Institute of Medicine published a landmark set of reports on emergency care in the United States. In Section 8 of the hospital-based report focused on emergency care research and recommended that the Secretary of the Department of Health and Human Services conduct a study to examine the gaps and opportunities in emergency and trauma care research and recommend a strategy for the optimal organization and funding of the research effort. Importantly, the study should consider training of new investigators and improved research coordination through a dedicated center or institute. And the report went on to say that Congress and federal agencies involved in emergency and trauma research should implement the study recommendations. This report, for the first time, gave us the language we needed to effectively advocate for increased federal funding in emergency care research. And in response, ACEP and SAEM created a joint task force charged with advocating for the implementation of these recommendations, which I had the privilege of co-chairing with Roger Lewis. In 2007, we had a historic meeting with the NIH Director, Elias Zerhouni, who in that meeting actually challenged us to define the fundamental hypothesis of emergency care research. He too was a skeptic. In the moment, we actually didn't come prepared with the answer to that question. But in a follow-up editorial, we proposed a potential overarching hypothesis that rapid diagnosis and early intervention in acute illness or decompensated chronic illness will improve outcomes. Following that meeting, the NIH held a series of roundtables in 2009 to define the scope of EM research. And these included roundtables on emergency trauma research, neurologic and psychiatric emergencies, and medical and surgical emergencies. And for those who haven't read these, I encourage you, you can download them at the QR code and take a look at these, because they really are sort of NIH's perspective on the scope of EM research. But more importantly, what was recognized in those roundtables that there was insufficient resources and infrastructure to train a robust pipeline of EM investigators able to successfully compete for NIH grants and fulfill NIH's mission. So one of the first major investments that NIH made in response to the IOM report was the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute K-12 program in emergency care research, launched in 2011. And these grants were awarded to individual departments who trained early career faculty investigators at their funded institution. The program lasted 10 years and was highly successful, with 74% of trainees securing subsequent NIH funding as PIs. So when Francis Collins took over for Dr. Zerhouni as the NIH director, we wanted to make sure that we did not lose momentum on implementation of the IOM recommendations, so we set up another meeting. And this meeting was focused on the recommendation to improve research coordination at NIH through a dedicated center or institute. And at that time, many people had been advocating for our own institute, and I'll talk a little bit later why I actually don't think that's a very good idea. But the result of that meeting was the creation of the Office of Emergency Care Research within NIH that is charged with catalyzing and coordinating translational and emergency care research and research training. And Jeremy Brown was named as the inaugural director and still is in that role. So what has been the return on these investments? One way to measure the return is growth in both grants and investigators, and based on those metrics, the impact has been significant. So in 2006, when the IOM report was released, there were 35 NIH-funded PIs and $16 million in annual funding to emergency medicine as a specialty. Fast forward to 2023, and you'll see that we are now sitting at 206 NIH-funded projects and $138 million in annual funding. In terms of PIs, we have progressed from 47 NIH-funded PIs in 2009 to 147 NIH-funded PIs in 2023. And the number of departments of emergency medicine with NIH-funded PIs has almost doubled from 23 to 45. So this is a good story. And we clearly have come a long way. But have we arrived? Or do we still have a long way to go to reach our full potential? So one way to gauge where we are on the journey is to benchmark ourselves against other specialties. And in 2020, we set out to do that with available data from the AAMC, the Blue Ridge Institute, and the NIH Reporter. And when you calculate the percent of full-time faculty who are NIH-funded PIs in various clinical specialties, the range is 1.7% to 21%, with an average of 8%. We sat in last place. When you calculate the percent of full-time faculty who are NIH-funded PIs in various clinical specialties, looking at another way, the percentage of academic departments with a clinical specialty, within clinical specialties that have NIH-funded PIs ranges from 33% of departments with NIH-funded PIs to 88%, with an average of 54%. Again, you can see EM came in last place, with 33% of our med school academic departments having NIH-funded PIs. So I don't know about you, but I really don't like being in last place. I really don't like that. And this analysis really revealed that although we made tremendous progress to date, we have a significant room for improvement. But that said, our current pipeline has important strengths. So this is 2023 data, where we currently have 29 active K awardees in emergency medicine. And importantly, it's the diversity across 8 different NIH institutes as well as AHRQ. So this is really exciting news for the future of these folks being future investigators in our specialty. T32 grants are an institutional training grant that provide funded research training slots for trainees that can be recruited into that slot, so the trainees themselves don't have to secure the funding. And this is really a powerful and stable mechanism to support training in postdoctoral and early career clinician scientists. And before 2016, there were no T32 institutional training grants held by EMPIs. But Lynn Richardson at Mount Sinai broke through that barrier with our first T32 training grant in 2016. And since then, we have seen steady growth, providing important infrastructure to our investigator pipeline, with now 5 T32s held by EMPIs in 2023 based on NIH Reporter. Another strength of our specialty in our current state is the diversity of our federal funding portfolio. While NHLBI, the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, the National Institute of Neurologic Disorders, and the National Institute of Drug Abuse support half of our NIH-funded projects, EMPIs have active funding in almost every NIH institute or center. And I don't think that can be said for any other specialty. And while NIH is our largest funding source by far, EM investigators have secured significant research funding across a broad array of federal agencies, including AHRQ, PCORI, CDC, SAMHSA, DoD, and the VA and DARPA. The diversity of our portfolio is a unique strength of our specialty, and in my opinion, provides a strong argument against the creation of a dedicated institute at the National Institute of Health, which could paradoxically limit our access to funding from these other sources. So where do we go from here? If we are not intentional about building the infrastructure needed to fulfill our research mission, we will never reach our full potential, and we are far from reaching it. In 2019, the Association for Academic Chairs of Emergency Medicine Research Working Group was charged with developing goals for EM research mission and strategies at the institutional, department, and national level to achieve those goals. And based on simply sustaining our historic rate of growth, the following 2030 goals were proposed and endorsed by the major organizations in emergency medicine. We set out to have 200 active NIH projects, $100 million in annual funding, with 150 PIs in 50 departments and 3% of our faculty being NIH-funded PIs. So these were the numbers when the publication came out in 2020. And I'm pleased to report in 2023 that we have exceeded the goals for active NIH projects and annual funding in emergency medicine. We are closing in on the goal for NIH-funded PIs, and we're making good progress in terms of departments with NIH PIs and the percent of our faculty who are NIH PIs. So, despite being on a promising trajectory, our future path is not without significant barriers. And I know all the chairs in the room are aligned with that. And we really have to address these barriers. And a survey of the Association for Academic Chairs of Emergency Medicine in 2022 revealed the following as the top 3 barriers to building a federally funded research program in their own department. And that included lack of a faculty pipeline, both faculty that are trained and faculty that are interested in a research career, inadequate financial resources to support research, and a lack of experienced federally funded mentors. So in response, I want to highlight several new initiatives aimed at addressing these barriers. So yesterday, we had a consensus conference supported by SAEM that focused on creating a diverse and sustainable EM investigator pathway. We discussed and prioritized strategies and programs to enhance the diversity of our research workforce and provide the needed infrastructure to optimize success, beginning at the undergraduate level and extending through mid-career faculty. We anticipate the results of this conference will be published by the end of the year, and many of you here, including residency program directors, funded faculty investigators, department chairs, and even SAEM leadership, are going to get some assignments. And we are confident that you will deliver. As previously noted, 45 departments of emergency medicine in the country have NIH-funded PIs, and our goal is to get to 50. Interestingly, if you look back through the history of emergency medicine, 62 different departments have at one time had EM-funded PIs, so that goal is not ambitious. And to help these departments and others develop sustainable federally funded research programs, SAEM, in partnership with the AACEM Research Working Group Committee, created a consult service, and this service will provide on-site evaluation of existing research infrastructure tailored and give tailored recommendations based on the department and the institutional goals. And we look forward to engaging those department chairs that are interested in pursuing this. Revisiting advocacy, one of the recommended strategies of the 2030 Research Strategic Goal paper was to create a national K-12 program that would support early career clinician scientists to train in their own institution with local and national mentorship. And in the past few years, SAEM, ACEP, and the American AACEM has strongly advocated for this strategy, and I'm pleased to announce today that such a program has been created by the National Institute of Neurologic Disorders and Stroke with co-sponsorship from the National Institute of Drug Abuse and the National Institute of Aging. And this program will train early career, specifically emergency medicine faculty in neurologic sciences research. This program will fund 3 new scholars each year, providing 3 years of support to train at their home institution, again, with local and national mentorship. And the first application deadline, so you can be prepared, is going to be October 1st, 2024, with funding of selected scholars starting July 1st of 2025. In addition, the National Foundation of Emergency Medicine has agreed to support a pipeline program associated with this that will support diverse cohort of EM trainees not yet ready to apply as scholars to attend the annual meeting, engage potential mentors, and prepare for future applications. And more detail about this program can be seen at the program website, which you can access through the QR code on the slide. So up to now, I've focused on emergency medicine research infrastructure and workforce in the United States. But I also want to introduce a bigger vision, and for that, I want to return to the sunrise analogy, but from a different perspective. It's a big planet, but it's getting smaller every day, and many believe that globalization of almost every major human enterprise is inevitable. EM is now a recognized specialty in over 50 countries, and investing in international research collaborations and global research networks will be essential at some time in our future if we want to maximize the capabilities and impact of our research mission and address the disparities in emergency care around the world. In an ideal world, the outcome of your medical emergency should not depend on where it occurs. So at this point, I know some of you are all in. You've already dedicated or plan to dedicate yourselves to a career in research, but some of you might be on the fence or even saying, why me? I will share with you that I never planned to do research when I went to medical school. But I was also naively expected that my professors would have all the answers. And the recognition that there's more that we don't know than we do know about medicine is what drove me to acquire the skills needed to answer the questions that I thought were most important and not have to wait for someone else to do it. To quote Marcus Aurelius, nothing has such power to broaden the mind as the ability to investigate systematically and truly all that comes under thy observation. As clinicians, we are consumers of knowledge. We need to consume the knowledge available to be able to provide the best care we can for our patients. And that knowledge is coming at us at a greater pace and volume than ever before. As faculty, it's also our job to be conveyors of knowledge. However, key to our success as a specialty is a core group of well-trained clinician scientists who are driven and equipped to create new knowledge that will improve the quality of care and outcomes of the patients we see every day. We cannot rely on others, either laboratory, clinical, health services, or education researchers outside our specialty, to be the drivers of scientific advancement in emergency care. We are in the best position to know what knowledge is needed, and we need to train ourselves to create the knowledge for the benefit of our patients. You all here and those in your institution are our future. If you're an undergrad, medical student, or fellow, I challenge you today to seek out mentors within or even outside your own institution who can train you to be an impactful clinician scientist. For our faculty investigators here, I challenge you to dedicate some of your time to recruiting and mentoring a diverse next generation of EM clinician scientists. And for our department chairs, I challenge you to secure and invest the resources needed to support a robust research program in your department. Finally, I want to close by saying that our aspirations are the only true limit to what we can accomplish. Back in 1995, when I submitted my first NIH-K award, I couldn't have imagined that 29 years later there would be 150 NIH-funded PIs in our specialty. But in reality, that is not a big number when you consider that our specialty treats 140 million patients in the United States every year. So where we go from here is only limited by what we aspire to achieve. For the sake of our patients, my hope is that we will aspire to achieve what has not yet been imagined. So thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to take questions if there's time. Any questions? Oh, looks like Opway has one.
Good morning, everyone, and Bob, thank you so much for the background and frankly, all you've done for the specialty. In terms of aspiration for where we should be from the 150, seems like, we discussed it at the chairs conference. Seems like we set these goals, but we got there, we're close to getting there pretty readily. So if we were to push ourselves in terms of aspiration, what should those numbers be that you put up there?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's a really good question. I've thought about that to some degree. I mean, when you look at those goals, though, those goals were based on our historic trajectory. and what we thought was feasible, by 2030. And certainly what we're seeing is not a linear progression, but we're seeing an exponential increase. So I think our potential is tremendous. And when you look at those numbers, we're starting at the bottom, right? So even if we double our funding, we're still going to be at the lower end of what other clinical specialties invest in their specialty and in their patient care. So I'm not going to be able to give you a number today, but I got to say that looking back, I regret a little bit that our 2030 goals weren't more ambitious, because we're probably going to achieve them before 2030. It's always good to underpromise and overdeliver, right? But we may need to revisit those. Maybe we'll revisit those soon to see what our more aspirational goals will be. I mean, if you look at the diversity of funding sources that we're able to tap into, and I mentioned that, even just across all institutes of NIH, we can get funding from every single institute, and then all the other federal programs as well. So really, like I said at the end of my talk, where we go is only limited by what we aspire to achieve. And emergency medicine is at the interface of inpatient and outpatient care. We could be a dominant force in medicine if we really make the right investments. So.
Bob, I'm Mike Brown from Michigan State University. Great presentation. I was excited about the new program to train clinician scientists, and that's what my question is about. As we know, it's very challenging to be a clinician scientist like yourself. There's so many barriers in life, just juggling so many different things. And I wonder what your thoughts are on the specialty as a whole. Of that 2% that you listed as funded PIs, emergency medicine PIs, what's the breakdown of that small number in terms of PhDs or MD PhDs versus an emergency medicine MD taking on that role of being NIH funded?
Yeah.
And where should we go in the future?
That is a really good question. In our published paper, I'll just warn you, I think I can only do one more question after this. Yeah, so really important question. When we did our analysis for the 2030 goals, we looked at the proportion of patients, the proportion of faculty in our specialty that are either MD PhDs or PhDs. And again, we are at the lowest percentage of any clinical specialty. So I can't tell you for sure exactly of our 150 PIs how many of them are PhD only or MD PhD, but I can say that other specialties have leveraged non-clinician scientists in their departments to advance their research mission. And it is a strategy we need to think about moving forward. So I don't know, who was first?
Yeah, so thanks, Bob. Ted Christopher, Jefferson, Philadelphia. So my question was Mike's question, and then one more. So 45 departments have NIH funding. So
NIH funding PIs, yeah. So they might have other funding as well.
Right. Is there a breakdown as to the type of university or department that sits in what kind of university? For example, is it, in my experience, is that the research-intensive reputational universities, the Harvards, the Yales, the Stanfords, those departments, University of Michigan, that are known for research powerhouses. It seems to me to be much easier because the university has an infrastructure that supports NIH funding applications. Yeah. Is there a breakdown of that 45?
So the numbers, the easiest way to look at the actual institutions is just to go to the Blue Ridge Institute, and they're all listed, so you can sort of see where they are. We haven't done an analysis of that, but I can say it's pretty diverse. So there are some that are very large research institutions, but there's some that are not. And the other way to think about it is other specialties have a higher proportion of their departments across the country with NIH-funded investigators. So again, I think if we're going to at least try to get to where other specialties have achieved, we have a long way to go. And I don't think it has to be just the most intense, research-intense institutions to be part of this.
Thank you.
Got time for a question?
He's the boss, right here. One more.
One more, okay.
So you, Bob, thank you for that wonderful talk. You mentioned that we shouldn't be arguing for like an NIH-specific institute for emergency medicine, but our specialty crosses, right now NIH is organized at a sort of organ system type structural basis, and our specialty crosses multiple organ systems. So what sort of strategies should our organization be arguing to change NIH structure, or should we?
I would not argue to change NIH structure. Well, first of all, they won't listen, right? So it's kind of a failed endeavor. I think what we need to do is, I would argue that we should leverage the fact that we touch almost every human disease, right? We touch almost every organ system. And it's really the strategic way that you submit your grant. So I do cardiac arrest research, right? But I study brain. So which institute do I go to? Do I go to NINDS or do I go to NHLBI? Well, NHLBI has a lot more money. So I've often gone to NHLBI and then spun the theme of the grant to be more focused on the cardiac arrest part of the research rather than the brain part of the research. So that's just one example of the strategy. So the key thing is to look at the NIH institutes and go into the website and read what their mission is, right? Because that's what the staff and the program officers are charged to do, and they're charged by Congress to fulfill that specific mission. And I see Jeremy standing up. So if your applications are aligned with that mission, if you align the goals of your applications with the mission of that institute, you will be successful. So that's the strategy. Jeremy. Last word. You get the last word.
You should have the last word. Jeremy Brown from NIH. Two things. Number one, I think the Zarhuni challenge is a complete distraction. It's like asking, what is the fundamental hypothesis of cardiovascular research? Or what is the fundamental hypothesis of neurological? There isn't one. If there were one, we'd have been addressing it. So to suggest that, now I understand you had to do what you had to do because he was the NIH director and he had to answer his question, but I do think it's a complete distraction and it's actually not a great question. The second thing I wanted to point is really a challenge to everybody. We're still living after COVID, and I think, at least from my reading, is that SAEM and ACEP have missed an opportunity to leverage what the work that everyone in this room and everyone's hospital did during COVID to show just how important this system is to the entire healthcare functioning of the United States. If you can't go to your congressperson now, having gone through COVID, and explain to them why this kind of work is important, then they will, what are we going to do? Wait till the next pandemic to explain that? I am not allowed to lobby for money, so I'm not. But if I were allowed, I would use COVID and what happened in COVID and this opportunity, and the further away we are from those days, and they seem pretty remote now, the further away we are, the less impactful people's memories fade quickly. So I really do think that the societies need to step up, and it's not going to the NIH that will get you dollars. It's going to the people who fund NIH that will get you dollars. And thank you for a great talk.
Yeah, I want to echo one point that you said. I mean, obviously, leveraging a crisis is a great opportunity, and we should take advantage of that. I will say that your point about going not just directly to NIH, but going to Congress and going to the government is really, really important. Those meetings did not happen by calling up the NIH director. Those meetings happened by Arlen, was asked by Arlen Specter, who was my senator in Pennsylvania, who asked Dr. Zarhuni for a meeting, right? So it's going to your congressmen, going to your senators, advocating at the federal level, because basically the NIH answers to Congress. And so if you get Congress to advocate for you, then advocate for us, we will succeed. So thank you.
Incredible presentation. Thank you, Dr. Newmar. I'd like to invite on the stage Dr. Jeff Klein, Editor-in-Chief of Academic Emergency Medicine, and Dr. Susan Promis, Editor-in-Chief of Academic Emergency Medicine Education and Training, to present the 2024 plenary abstracts.
Thank you, Dr. Will. Thank you, Dr.
I'm just trying to stall things because we haven't been here long enough. Thank you, Dr. LaFollette. It's my pleasure and honor to kick off the scientific portion of SAEM24 with a presentation of the best research this year. Each of these abstracts has undergone independent, objective peer review, and today you're going to hear from the best of the best. 8 abstracts were selected for plenary sessions. You'll hear half of them today. With that, let's move along to the first presentation entitled Visualization of Occult Ventricular Fibrillation by Echocardiography During Cardiac Arrest, a Multicenter Trial, presented by Dr. Romolo Gaspari from the University of Massachusetts, Chan Medical School.
So I'd like to thank SAEM for having me present the research. I represent a multi-center research trial, the Rosen Network, and I'll be talking about occult VFib in echo during cardiac arrest. I have no conflict of interest. So when we work in the emergency department and we see patients that come in with cardiac arrest, we generally treat them based on their electric rhythm. That's how ACLS works. We look at them as PEA, asystole, and we make our decisions that way. However, over the last couple of years, it's been noticed that ultrasound performed during cardiac arrest can identify the cardiac rhythm as well. Slightly different, but it can be analogous. So we have noticed that you will see something like this in cardiac arrest. So this is an echo showing VFib. You'll notice the heart isn't beating, but that the myometrium is writhing in place. So our study goal was to measure the percentage of out-of-hospital cardiac arrest patients that present with occult VFib. Occult VFib meaning VFib that's visualized by echo but not identified by ECG. So there were 32 emergency departments across the United States and Canada prospectively enrolling patients as a convenience sample. Patients were eligible if they arrived to the emergency department after atraumatic out-of-hospital cardiac arrest, and an echo was performed during the pauses in CPR. The echo and the ECG had to be done simultaneously and digitally recorded. Patients were followed till survival to hospital discharge, and all data was electronically uploaded to a central database in REDCap. The recorded echo and ECGs that were simultaneous were independently interpreted by 2 experienced physicians. The images were blinded, and all patient and sonographer information was removed. 1 cardiologist and 1 emergency physician reviewed them independently and separately. The ECG was interpreted for the cardiac rhythm, so PEA, asystole, and such. The echo was interpreted for the type of cardiac activity. No cardiac activity, twitching, organized cardiac activity, or VFib. If those 2 initial interpretations differed, then there was adjudication by a third, could be a cardiologist or an emergency physician. The primary outcome was the percent of patients that presented with occult VFib, and the secondary outcome was survival to hospital discharge. Comparisons are presented here as 95% confidence intervals, and agreement between the reviewers presented as a kappa analysis. So there were 957 patients that were entered into the database. You can see the exclusion here, 23 because the ECG and echo were actually not done during the arrest, 12 because they were missing data, and 5 because the survival was yet unknown. So what you see here are 2,046 pauses in CPR. You see simultaneous ECG and echo data. You'll note that in the ECG, 19.2% of the patients had VFib. In the echo data, 9.9% of the patients had echo VFib. And if you look at that 9.9% of the echo VFib, a little over half of them actually had VFib by ECG. Some of the patients, 11%, had VTAC by ECG, and a minority had occult VFib. So let's look at the occult VFib. The majority of the occult VFib actually was identified as PEA by the expert review, And only minority was the fine VFib, which was asystole. So overall, if we're looking at just the pauses in CPR, 3% of the pauses showed occult VFib. I don't have all the fancy slides to pull that together, but this is the same analysis looking at the patient data. We actually finished the adjudication about 3 days ago, and I was able to pull the data by patient here. And if you look at the patient data, 81 of the 917 patients that were enrolled, or 8.8%, demonstrated occult VFib during the first 3 pauses in CPR. We chose the first 3 pauses because it's not clear that VFib identified later in a cardiac arrest may have as much clinical relevance. So what you'll see here is another echo of a patient in VFib. So this is occult VFib where the ECG is listed below. ECG was interpreted as PEA with artifact by the expert review. And for those of you that look at that echo and or that ECG and say, well, I would have called that VFib and defibrillated it, I'll show you 5 ECGs here that have accompanying echoes. And one of these ECGs had organized contractions. The rest were VFib by echo. I challenge you which one of these you would identify. So, number 3 actually was a patient that had an echo with organized contractions. The rest had VFib identified. And I'll challenge you that number 1 and 3 are very difficult to tell apart. This is a survival data. So of the 917 patients, the very top, it splits into if they have a shockable rhythm or not. And then as you drop down, it shows if they showed echo VFib or not. And if we go all the way to the bottom, I'm going to blow this up so you can see it. We're going to look at the survival for these patients. So when we're looking at occult VFib versus ECG VFib, survival was no different statistically. 28% survival to hospital admission for occult VFib and roughly 15% for ECG VFib. Same was true for survival to hospital discharge. You'll note that the kappa for this shows a kappa of 0.67, which is rated as good but not great for the interpretation between the 2 expert reviewers. Again, this data is from the first 3 pauses in CPR. If we're looking at the ECG VFib, and we split it between those patients that had echo VFib and ECG VFib, or echo VFib and no ECG VFib, what you'll see is survival to hospital admission was greater if they were in VFib by both, compared to patients that had echo VFib and some other rhythm identified by, ECG VFib and some other rhythm identified by echo. Comparison was 31% versus 8% in survival to hospital admission. And if you look at survival to hospital discharge, statistically there's no difference, but it was 6.8% hospital discharge if they were both VFib and 2.5% for the other group. There are some limitations we should note with this. Echo during VFib is really a novel concept. It's not really in anyone's armamentarium to see VFib and grab an ultrasound. And this may have contributed to some of our selection bias. These echo were interpreted by expert reviewers that had seen thousands of echoes. It's not clear that experienced clinicians have the same results. And I would note that the agreement between expert reviewers was not great. It was good. I would say that taking people who are experienced in looking at echoes and asking them to look for VFib is not a natural thing to ask, so I don't know that the expertise correlated 100%. In summary, 8.8% of cardiac arrest patients demonstrated occult VFib during their first 3 pauses in CPR. 3% of all pauses were occult VFib. The majority of occult VFib, almost 80%, was PEA by ECG and not asystole. Survival to hospital admission seems to be no different when you see VFib in either way. However, the presence of echo VFib during ECG VFib may be associated with increased survival. I do want to recognize all of the co-investigators that helped with this study. This was an unfunded study, and it would not have been possible without their contributions. And I will take any questions.
I'm going going to stay here instead of getting up and down. This abstract is open for questions. Please come to the microphone and say your name and institution.
No, I can't go before the chair of the University of Michigan, please.
Fascinating presentation and really important work. My question is, you might have said I didn't see, is, so how many cases was the occult VFib actually shocked? And, or was it ever shocked because it wasn't read as VFib, by ECG? So are you shocking based on the echo alone? And then if it is shocked, how often does it convert?
So we were pulling this data together at the last minute to get it here. About 44% of occult VFib was shocked. Some of them were shocked the next pause in CPR when it was identified, and some of them were identified up front. There was a bit of a learning curve as people who were enrolling these started identifying VFib, they started shocking a little bit more. As far as how many converted to sinus, that's going to be embedded within the hospital admission. We haven't pulled out that individualized data.
So you're actually making the decision to shock based on the echo alone throughout the study?
So some of the co-investigators, when they started noticing that there would be echo VFib, would look again at the ECG, whether they were re-identifying it or just identifying it off of the echo, they would shock at that time.
Dr. Gaspari, thank you for presenting. My question is, you showed that a kappa of 0.67 for the EKG fib, but then it was also 0.67 for the echo for fib. Is that correct? The kappa was 0.67 for both of them?
No, that was the kappa for the echo. I do have the kappa for the ECG. I didn't present it here just so that it wouldn't, I was trying not to confuse people.
I'm curious, do you know, was the kappa for the EKG a lot better, a lot worse?
If I remember correctly, it was around 0.8, 0.79, so it was not great. The ECGs, when we think of ECG, everyone envisions the 12 lead that we get for chest pain. They're completely different in cardiac arrest. There's a lot of artifact. So the kappa is much less than the published rates of when you're looking at ECG.
Yeah, I was just curious compared to echo. Hey, thank you so much. Thank you.
Congrats on a great study. Simple question. Did you measure the time to do the echoes? Was there, did you have any sense of whether it added extra time between pauses in CPR?
So that was a very hot topic a number of years ago. We have looked at it in other studies, but not in this study.
Can I just clarify, you said that this was an unfunded study, is that right?
That is correct.
So I think everybody needs to listen to that. You put together, I think you said there were 22 sites?
32.
32 sites. And you did this, a difficult protocol to follow, at a time when there's maximum stress on patient care, and you pulled this off without funding. You don't always need funding in order to do great research. I just want to point that out, and kudos to you and your team for doing it.
Thank you. I will say it would have been easier with funding.
Thank you, Dr. Gaspari. Our next presentation is titled Pharmacy Density as a Community-Level Predictor of Heart Failure Medication Non-Adherence, a Geospatial Analysis, presented by Mr. Matthew Dirthaler at Indiana University School of Medicine.
Hello, thank you everyone for coming out, and thank you SAEM for having me up here. Today I'm going to be talking about our geospatial analysis in which we used pharmacy density to analyze medication non-adherence in the setting of acute decompensated heart failure patients. Here are disclosures. So, acute decompensated heart failure accounts for over 1 million emergency department visits per year in the United States, and medication non-adherence is a common precipitating factor of these decompensations. We wanted to identify community-level barriers to medication adherence, and what better place to start than pharmacies. So the objective of this study was to identify, is community pharmacy density in a patient's neighborhood associated with ED visits for ADHF due to medication non-adherence? So I'll give a brief overview of our methodology, and then I'll get into the geospatial methods in a bit later. But to start out, note that we used 7 regional EDs across central Indiana. As you can tell from the volume data and the map, it ranged from rural freestanding EDs to large urban level 1 trauma centers. But from these 7 regional EDs, we gathered a convenient sample of thousands of patients potentially presenting with ADHF. But we had to sift through the actual ADHF and the non-ADHF. And to do that, we used double rater adjudication, and they referenced the European Society of Cardiology guidelines to make those diagnoses. Additionally, we searched the EMR to identify whether or not medication non-adherence was what prompted this emergency care episode. And after we gathered 342 patients with verified ADHF, we found their addresses in the EMR and geocoded them. Additionally, we identified 402 active community pharmacies in our area of interest, and we geocoded those as well. Geocoding these pharmacies allowed for us to do a hotspot analysis, or in this instance, a cold spot analysis, so that we could identify pharmacy deserts, which we defined as a pharmacy cold spot at the 99% confidence level. From there, we did negative binomial regression to find the relationship between pharmacy deserts and ED visits due to ADHF from medication non-adherence. So in order to understand the geospatial analysis, it's important to understand the boundaries that we're working with and the units that we're working with. This map shows the Indianapolis-Carmel-Muncie combined statistical area, which is a region of central Indianapolis consisting of 20 counties, about 2.5 million people. But the important thing about this is that it contains 600 census tracts. Now, census tracts were our geographic unit of interest, and we use these because unlike other geographic units such as counties, which are written up based on space within them, census tracts are written up based on the population. So as you can see in the bottom right, about 4,000 people reside in each census tract, no matter the size of the census tract, and that allowed us to adjust for both population and social determinants of health. So this map is a zoomed-in map of the 600 census tracts. That pink square represents the boundaries of Marion County, which is the largest county in Indianapolis by population, and its borders are essentially the same as Indianapolis's, so I will be using those interchangeably. But as you can see, Indianapolis has a lot of census tracts, and that is because it is very population dense, especially when you compare it to some of the rural counties in the outskirts, where the census tracts are much larger. So this is a map of the 402 active community pharmacies superimposed on those 600 census tracts. Now what we did is we geocoded the number of pharmacies to each census tract, and this allowed us to perform a hotspot analysis or cold spot analysis using the Geddes or GI star statistic. Now as you can see on the right with the legend, a hotspot is indicated by red, and that means there's lots of pharmacies for the amount of people that live there, and a cold spot is indicated by blue, and that means there are fewer pharmacies there for the amount of people. The coldest of the cold spots, the darkest blue, is what we indicated as those pharmacy deserts, those pharmacy cold spots at the 99% confidence level. And as you can see, a lot of those pharmacy deserts are isolated to or clustered in central Indianapolis. Now you may look at the map on the left and think, how is it possible to have so many pharmacy deserts in a place that has so many pharmacies? And once again, that is because we are accounting for the population. Indianapolis has far fewer pharmacies for the people living there, especially when you compare it to somewhere like Carmel, Indiana, which is to the north and is the darkest red on the map. So after we did our hotspot analysis, we geocoded those patient addresses to the census tracts and stratified them by adherent versus non-adherent. Once again, this allowed us to adjust by population as well as social determinants of health. And if you'll note in the bottom right, we found that 18% of our 342 patients were found to have non-adherence as what precipitated their visit for ADHF. So to adjust for these social determinants of health, we used the CDC Social Vulnerability Index, which is a 0 to 15 composite score of multiple social determinant of health variables at the census tract level. The variables of interest are listed in the left, and on the right we see the SVI by percentile scale to census tracts nationally. So those yellow census tracts in central Indianapolis would be the most vulnerable. So after adjusting for social vulnerability index and total ADHF patient counts per tract, We found that pharmacy deserts had an almost threefold incidence rate of ED visits for ADHF due to medication non-adherence. And we also performed a sensitivity analysis excluding the census tracts that had 0 ADHF patients, as we figured those may be systematically different over the period of study, but we still found it to be an over twofold incidence rate in pharmacy deserts. So some of the limitations of this study are due to it being retrospective, observational, using a convenient sample. The reliability of the EMR data, sometimes the things that we were interested in were totally absent, and the information is at best secondhand. Additionally, we only used 7 EDs. There's more than 7 EDs in Indianapolis alone, so it would be feasible for us to get more data. And finally, it's important to acknowledge that SVI, that Social Vulnerability Index, is a community-level measure rather than a patient-level measure, so we're actually measuring the vulnerability of the census tracts rather than the patients themselves. So, in our conclusions, pharmacy deserts were found to have a much higher incidence rate of ED visits for ADHF due to medication non-adherence after adjusting for other social determinants of health. While building new pharmacies in these neighborhoods may be difficult due to logistics or cost-related barriers, meeting these patients where they live with their medication may be a feasible way of reducing medication non-adherence. Interestingly, in research that we were presenting on Friday at noon, we found that patients that were non-adherent to their medications also had a greater risk of being prescribed medications that were outlined outside of the guideline-directed medical therapy, suggesting that medication-related disparities may be compounding. Overall, it is important for us to meet these patients where they live with their heart failure medication to prevent non-adherence, as well as preventable ED visits. And existing models that we could adopt include simple door delivery, as well as mobile health clinics that include the patient's medications on board. However, future research is, of course, needed to identify the success and implementation of these models in this high-risk patient population. Any questions?
If you could please state your name and your institution, followed by the question.
Jeremy Brown, NIH. I'm not familiar with pharmacy deserts, but I'm familiar with food deserts. If you were to map a food desert on top of a pharmacy desert, do you think there would be overlap?
That's a great question, and I think that's something that I personally would love to look at, but I can't say for certain. I would assume potentially,
assume so
but
too, yeah.
But
so I'm just wondering, when we look at one thing, pharmacy, maybe, these are markers of something else. And I think the social determinants of health are the real underlying markers, the real underlying causes here, and everything springs from that. So thank you, it's great. It's really interesting.
Thank you.
Hi, John DeAngelis, University of Rochester. I wanted to ask why you chose Social Vulnerability Index over something like the Area Deprivation Index. My understanding is that the SVI, since it's through the CDC, is more dedicated to looking at vulnerability in the face of disasters, pandemics, those sorts of things, and the Neighborhood Atlas, which tracks the area deprivation, tends to get more at sort of some of the social determinants of health, I think would be more akin to the population you were looking at. So I was just curious what your choice was and why.
That's a great question, and I wouldn't be the best person to ask that. I could defer to my PI, Dr. Harrison, and you're free to email him, but I personally, it would be, I think, interesting to, look at those two things, but I personally don't know. Thanks for the question, though.
The short answer is this is part of this is actually a preliminary analysis of finishing out a larger data set, and we didn't expect that this would get accepted as a plenary. So we didn't have time to look at both. But no, I definitely take the point. The other, I think, broader issue is using a global, this is the only way that we could do it, because we tried to extract social determinants variables from the EMR, and it just wasn't particularly reliable, and they didn't have a very useful or plausible effect within our causal model and when we ran our multivariable model. What we need is a prospective study that's not modeling the other social determinants at the tract level, but at the individual level, where we're interviewing patients about their individual circumstances, so that we can, separate that causal model into, okay, to Dr. Brown's point, like all of this stems from social determinants of health, but that's a lot of factors, right? And like that's a huge web if you're drawing out that DAG, and we need to do a prospective study to sort of isolate the individual things there.
I have time for one more brief question.
Hi, Dave Buckler from Mount Sinai, New York. Thank you for doing this study and bringing more geospatial analysis into this realm. Is there a particular reason that you aggregate at the census tract level rather than looking at individual point-to-point or point-to-group density of pharmacies around a patient to account for the edge effects where you have a pharmacy that's not in the same tract and how that may have affected?
Right, and once again, that's a great question, and I think could be, my understanding is pretty baseline, but I know the hotspot analysis takes account for a lot of those, a lot of variables that I'm not 100% certain on. Dr. Harrison, do you have any? Yeah.
Same as the last answer.
Good answer. We're going to have to move along to the next abstract.
Thank you.
Our third presentation is entitled Implementation of Artificial Intelligence Informed Risk-Driven Emergency Department Triage Decreases Length of Stay for High-Risk Chest Pain, presented by Dr. Jeremiah Henson from Johns Hopkins.
Well, thank you. I want to start my presentation by pointing out that the last presenter was a third-year medical student, so that's pretty impressive. So if you talk about the future of emergency medicine, that's pretty bright. My name is Jeremiah Henson. I'm Associate Director for Research at Hopkins. I'm excited to share a study with you that was done as a collaboration between Johns Hopkins, Yale School of Medicine, and Beckman Coulter. I'll start with a disclosure, which is sort of a success story. Well, it's a success story. We developed the technology we'll be talking about today through AHRQ-funded research starting in 2015. We then had a National Science Foundation supported SBIR to start a small Hopkins-affiliated startup company. And then that company was acquired by a large Fortune 500 company who has commercialized the technology, which actually enabled us to be able to do the study and to disseminate the technology across the country. At Hopkins, I co-direct a Center for Data Science and Emergency Medicine. We're a big group of people from multiple schools in the university, engineers, physicians, and computer scientists who are working together to use data to improve decision-making in emergency medicine. We've been really fortunate to secure a lot of funding and do some cool studies together. We're always looking for people to collaborate with. I'll have my email address at the end. If you're interested, please email me. The study we're talking about today was done in collaboration, and really the implementation was led by investigators at Yale. These guys here who are giants in emergency medicine research, and you'll be familiar with them already. These are the 3 hospitals I'll be talking about where the tool was implemented. So what are we talking about and why? I'm going to focus on the cohort of patients with chest pain. The reason is that they're a really good example of how an intervention like this can change management for a specific patient population. In the emergency departments in the United States, we have over 8 million visits for chest pain every year. Less than 6% of those are for life-threatening conditions. Identifying that 6% among the sea of patients who are presenting is really, really challenging, and we have to do it really quickly. There are a lot of decision points in emergency medicine, and our group has applied AI and machine learning to each of these. We as physicians tend to think about these last three, diagnosis, treatment, and disposition. But the very first decision that is made in emergency medicine is actually triage. It's made by really skilled, experienced nurses who are working on the front line. And that decision, we've done a ton of research not related to AI on triage, showing that that decision really drives a ton of downstream decision making. And that's true whether you have an upfront process with a provider in triage, et cetera. The level that is assigned to patients is very important. What is the status quo? So what has been used? Well, since 1999, we've been using the Emergency Severity Index. This is used in more than 80% of emergency departments. It was a really incredible innovation. It was introduced then. It uses nurse intuition and experience along with prediction by the nurse of how many resources they think the patient is going to utilize in the emergency department to assign a triage acuity 1 through 5. If you're 1 or 2, you have a clear trajectory. You have to be seen right away within 15 minutes. If you are 4 or 5, you also have a pretty clear trajectory. You're probably going to be siphoned off into a fast track or vertical care area. But these patients in the level 3 bucket are a big problem. Some of them are really sick. Many of them have very low acuity illness, but they're going to require a lot of resources. And this is a big problem to ED operations. Unfortunately, these are studies from our group here where you can read more about this, but unfortunately across the country, over 2/3 of patients are triaged to this middle tier level 3 bucket. That's a big problem for triage. Also, because the scale that we're using is pretty subjective, we have a lot of variability. So the assignment from one nurse to another is about as good as a flip of a coin, and then there's opportunity for a lot of bias under that system. Finally, because this system focuses on resource utilization instead of clinical risk, there's a lot of under-triage. There have been a ton of papers published on this. The last was last year out of Kaiser, over 6 million patients, showing that 1/3 of all patients who required a life-stabilizing intervention in the ED were triaged to level 3 through 5. Not great. So what did we do? This is research that dates back to 2014-15 and originally published in 2019 in Annals of Emergency Medicine, but we decided to use all the data that we're collecting and to just totally flip the script on the way that we triage patients. We built a series of machine learning models, first using NAMSIS data and then local Hopkins data, where we predict 3 outcomes: a critical care outcome, which is defined as going to an ICU or dying. A second outcome is requiring an emergency procedure or surgery within 12 hours of leaving the ED, and then the final outcome is requiring admission. The predictor variables that we use for this are the exact same variables that are already collected by triage nurses across the country. So we don't change anything in the workflow. So these are chief complaint, vital signs, demographics, we exclude race, arrival mode, and then we pull medical history from the electronic medical record. And we're actually using random forest models to do this. These 3 models are applied in parallel, and then we use risk thresholding based on the probabilities that are generated to assign recommended triage acuity scores at the individual patient level in real time. So these algorithms have been used in over 1 million patients. We've had it in place for over 7 years at Hopkins. And when we go to a new site, we retrain and optimize the algorithms for operation locally. When the nurse actually sees the algorithm play out, it's in their workflow. They put in information in the moment that they advance to the next screen. They get a triage acuity recommendation. They get an explanation of why it's giving that recommendation, and then they can choose to agree with it or put a different score in so that they retain autonomy. So that's sort of methods, but I want to get to the methods that we're looking at in this particular study. So what did we do? So this is a multi-site ED-wide QI intervention with a stepped wedge implementation or staggered implementation where we're replacing ESI with this AI triage system. And we start at one site and then progress to another site over time. We split our study periods into a pre-intervention and post-intervention at each site, and that was defined as the 180 days before and the 180 days after implementation. We pull all of these encounters together. Across the three sites, there were around 80 to 90,000 total encounters, but here we're talking about this group with chest pain. There's a larger publication underway for the whole group led by Andrew Taylor under review now. But we're looking at 6,000 patients with chest pain before and 6,000 patients with chest pain after. What were we interested in measuring? Really treatment times, because that's what we can impact with triage, and honestly, in our specialty, that's one of the most important things that we influence. So we looked at ED length of stay, and then we also looked at the time from ED arrival to intervention, so one of these emergency procedures. We stratified this analysis into two different groups because they're really different, right? So there's the group of patients who are going to go home, and they were identified as not being really high risk, and then the group of patients who are admitted, and within that bucket, the group of patients who require an emergency procedure, and of those procedures, which were cardiovascular procedures affecting the heart or great vessels, and then cardiac catheterization as well. Because a lot of things happen in an ED, and it can be really hard to understand what is happening with an operational intervention because a lot of things change over time, we performed just standard unadjusted analyses and then analyses that were adjusted using median regression modeling that accounted for confounders at the patient level and then also at the system level. So we adjusted for volume within the system, the time of day, and then boarding status as well. So what did we find? Well, this is the requisite cohort characteristics. They're the same, right? No big differences in the population of patients with chest pain before and after implementation of AI triage. We saw a big shift in triage distributions. This was not surprising because we designed the intervention to actually do that. So that was the goal. There were too many level 2s and too many level 3s in the system. Wasn't being well distributed, so we changed that. We did that by shifting a lot of patients into the low acuity, and we're able to do that because we're getting rid of this resource constraint and really focusing on clinical risk. Something that is, we don't have time to show all the figures in this presentation, but despite the fact that we're pushing more people into the low acuity, they were actually less sick than they were before. So a bigger number of patients with lower clinical acuity, and then the clinical acuity is really concentrated in that level 2 bucket. So this is our first outcome that we were looking at. Okay, so the tables on your left are really just the raw numbers in minutes of median length of stay for these different groups before and after implementation. And then the one on the right is the unadjusted and adjusted differences in length of stay in minutes. And the take-homes here are that despite the fact that we put a lot more people into this low acuity group and drove a lot more people through fast-track areas within the EDs, we didn't have any increase in the length of stay for the discharged patients. So we're getting them out just as fast. But we did have a 1-hour reduction in length of stay for those that got hospitalized and a 2-hour reduction for those requiring emergency procedure. How can that really be happening? Well, this is what we saw at Hopkins as well and other places that we have implemented. The reason for that is that we're identifying the patients who are sick. We're getting rid of the noise in the level 2 population that goes to a bed, and we're able to identify them and take action faster. When we look at time to treatment, the actual procedure, we saw before adjusting, we're talking like almost 6 hours, but after we adjust for other things that were happening, to make a conservative estimate, we see a 3-hour reduction in the time to a cardiovascular procedure and a 4-hour reduction in the time to get to cardiac cath. I would guess this is not really STEMI patients here who are getting activated right away, but people who need urgent catheterization. And these are all occurring within 12 hours, so it's a big reduction. So limitations, of course we have limitations, right? This is a QI intervention with a pre and post analysis. It can be very complicated to interpret these data. We designed the study ahead of time, so we really collected data prospectively and planned how we were going to do the analysis, and we were able to do pretty robust median regression analyses, but there's still a limitation. A single health system, we did look at different hospitals within that, but that is a limitation. And we used EHR data. We do rely on timestamps that are reliably calculated or reliably captured, and there really are minimal missing data in the types of outcomes that we're looking at, but this is a limitation of any large-scale EHR-based study. So this is my conclusion. Artificial intelligence-informed risk-driven decision support for ED triage changed the prioritization of patients with chest pain, and it was associated with large reductions in ED length of stay and time to procedure for the highest risk group. We did that without increasing length of stay for the low-risk group and no adverse outcomes in the low-risk group that I haven't shown here but could talk about. So happy to answer any questions and appreciate your time.
Open for questions. We only have time for one.
Thank you very much, Mark Courtney from UT Southwestern. Not super surprising that there was some improvement to some degree in predictive ability compared to ESI. That's kind of a lot more subjective in nature. You've put a lot into the model, a lot of objective characteristics, but you're still stuck with this subjective characteristic of chest pain. Right? Chest pain means one thing to nurse X, it means another thing to nurse Y or Z. How sensitive do you think overall your predictive model is to this concept, this construct called chief complaint, that really kind of maybe is a lot more wishy-washy than we think and dependent upon human input?
Yeah, so it's a great question. Good to see you, Mark. The answer is a little bit complicated. So we use a classification schema for chief complaints that follows this AHRQ reason for visit classification. We cannot get, these are usually patient-reported chief complaints, but still, even between patients, like the report of a chief complaint can be very different. And we're mapping everything from chest burning to chest pressure. All of these things go to chief complaint. We use lasso regressions, which we apply during the model training process. So if there are certain aspects of chest pain, when the model runs, it will pick those out as more important, and they'll have independent predictive value. So that's a part of the retraining process for the model. But anytime you're using structured data, a little bit challenging, yep.
Thanks.
Yep, absolutely.
Thank you, Dr. Hinson.
Thank you.
Our final presentation is titled Emergency Department Utilization by Youth Before and After Firearm Injury, presented by Dr. Suma Kumal at Ann and Robert H. Lurie Children's Hospital of Chicago.
I don't think that's my presentation, that's the only thing.
Could we, I believe we need to switch presentation there.
Could you please advance?
I can also start without it. So while they're working on that, just in the interest of time, I'll get started. Thank you guys so much for having me today. I'm a pediatric emergency medicine fellow at Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago, and I'm very passionate about firearm violence in children, which is the topic of this presentation. So as some of you may know, in 2020, firearms became the leading cause of death for children in the United States, and at least twice as many children sustain non-fatal firearm injuries as fatal firearm injuries. And beyond death and injury, there are many poor outcomes associated with firearm injuries that impact youth, their families, and the healthcare system that cares for them. So we were really interested in considering the different phases of an injury, and we wanted to think about the opportunities within the healthcare system itself to improve youth's trajectory both before and after firearm injury. Our question was, if youth are interacting with their healthcare system before the injury, are there opportunities to prevent the injury itself? And if they're interacting with the healthcare system after their injury, are there opportunities to better support them to prevent future injury and adverse outcomes? And we thought the emergency department was a really important place to consider for prevention and intervention strategies. There have been prior studies that have shown that ED-based interventions for youth with injury-related risk behaviors are effective, yet many of those studies have been performed in pediatric EDs, and we know that most children are actually cared for in general EDs, which may have fewer pediatric-specific resources. So if we're going to consider where to put these interventions, we have to think about both if children are utilizing the ED before or after their firearm injury, and where they are presenting to for their ED care during that time. So we performed a retrospective cross-sectional study using the Healthcare Cost and Utilization Project's 2019 SED and SID databases from 8 states with high-quality pediatric longitudinal data. And we used patient identifiers to follow up those patients within those states. We looked at all ED encounters for youth 0 to 18 years of age who presented with an ICD-10 code for firearm injury, and we considered the index encounter to be the first encounter for an initial encounter for firearm injury in the year that we examined for each patient. The primary outcomes that we looked at were having an ED encounter in the 90 days before or 90 days after the index injury. I'm just gonna keep going. Okay, we're just gonna do this without any slides, guys. Use your imagination. All right, So I had a pretty slide that showed our different cohorts, but the kind of summary of that was that we divided our sample into 3 different cohorts to make sure that we had the opportunity for uniform look back and follow-up durations. So for example, if you were in the subset or cohort of our patients that had the opportunity for an ED encounter in the 90 days before index injury, that means you had to initially present between April to December and so on. And then the primary exposure that we had was the type of ED at the index injury encounter, and we defined ED type based off of the pediatric resources available at the hospital level. So a pediatric ED was defined as a freestanding children's hospital or a hospital that admitted children and had a pediatric intensive care unit. And all other EDs were considered general. And then our other variables that we looked at in our analysis were age, sex, race and ethnicity, urbanicity, and we have a slide, and payer. So I'm gonna just zoom through to the next little bit. Oh, you guys can't see it. So we'll just keep going, no problem. So eventually I'll show you our results. Yay. Oh, yay, great. So we're gonna zoom, see pretty slides, and then we are at results. Okay, this is the most important thing to see anyways. So when we did our study, a total of 1,035 youth met inclusion criteria for our study. The majority of youth were adolescents, male, non-Hispanic Black, publicly insured, and living in a metropolitan area. The majority of our youth were seen at general EDs for their index injury encounter. While most youth were seen at an ED with a trauma center affiliation, most youth were not seen at a pediatric trauma center. Most youth were discharged from the ED after that index injury visit, and few youth were transferred, including from pediatric to general EDs or vice versa. In the subset of our sample where we could look back 90 days from the time of their index injury encounter, we found that 13% of youth had a prior visit, and 68% of those visits occurred at general EDs, with 22% of visits specifically for injury or poisoning. In the subset of our sample in which we could look forward 90 days from the index injury, we found that 24% of youth had a return visit, and half of those occurred in general EDs, and a third of those visits were specifically for injury or poisoning. Importantly, among those revisits for injury or poisoning, 69% of them were coded as an initial encounter for firearm injury, suggesting that these were new firearm injuries in this previously firearm injured cohort. So that impacted 38 youth in our sample. We then did logistic regression analyses to look at associations for ED utilization with ED site level and patient level characteristics. We found that females were more likely than males to have a visit both before and after their index injury, and we found that youth with other and missing race and ethnicities were less likely to have a prior visit. We found no differences based off of age, urbanicity, payer, and type of ED for having an ED visit both before or after the index injury. This would have been a really hard slide to present without the picture, so I'm glad we have it. So the last thing that we looked at was the subset of our sample in which we could both look back and look forward 90 days from their index injury. First, if you look at the site of the index injury visit in the center pane and then look back 90 days from the index injury, we see that most youth did not have a prior encounter. But among those youth who did have a prior encounter, the arrows indicate that few youth change ED type between their index visit and their prior visit. Turning to the sample looking forward 90 days from the index injury, we see a similar trend where few youth are changing ED type between visits. And then looking at the full picture at the longitudinal care of patients before, during, and after an index visit for firearm injury, we see that few youth change ED type between pediatric and general EDs across longitudinal encounters. Our study had its limitations. First and foremost, we identified our sample population using ICD-10 codes, which have the potential for misclassification bias. Specifically, we tried to capture true index visits for firearm injury and true repeat visits for firearm injury, but there was a potential for inaccurate coding. We also considered residual confounding, given that many administrative data sets are lacking some of the important factors that may impact a use risk for ED utilization and firearm injury in general. We also acknowledge that there are age restrictions of trauma centers. Typically, they may not accept patients above the age of 15 or 16, and they may have impacted where youth attended for that index injury visit. And lastly, due to only having a single year of ED encounters limited to 8 states, that may limit the generalizability of our results. So in summary, youth with firearm injuries have high rates of ED utilization both before and after their firearm injury. And we see that 1/3 of youth who return come back with recurrent injury. Importantly, our data also shows that youth generally do not change the ED type that where they seek care across ED visits, and that half of youth with firearm injuries receive their care exclusively in general emergency departments. So if we focus our implementation of interventions specifically in pediatric EDs, we would lose a very critical population of these high-risk youth. Moving forward, it will be important that all sites that care for children have the resources that they need to provide not only the important medical care for the injury itself, but to also consider targeted injury prevention efforts and other evidence-based interventions to improve youth outcomes following firearm injury. Thank you so much for bearing with me, and I will take any questions.
Dr. Kamal, thank you for a great presentation. That was really challenging without the slides. We're now open for questions.
Hi, Jenny Cook, Research Manager at OHSU. And I just have a question. Were you able to subset at all for the urban versus rural versus suburban for that ED change or not? Or was the population maybe just too small to really look and see if there was a change in EDs there?
Meaning, did they change ED type between visits?
Yeah, were they more likely like in an urban environment versus a rural?
So our rural population was only 4% of this sample. It was quite small, which may be just representative of the states that we included. So we didn't subset out to look specifically at the rural population for that. Thank you.
Dr. Kamal, that was amazing. I can't believe you did that with half of it without slides, which is probably the purpose of this question, because I couldn't see what methods you used. But the Christian Pulcini, University of Vermont, one thing I wanted to clarify, and I know Dr. Klein is well aware of this from a firearm paper that we did a few years ago, is that we accidentally included airgun injuries that are sort of lumped into the CDC codes for firearm injuries. And we found that we lost about a couple thousand of our subjects who are errantly classified as firearm injury. I just wanted to check and make sure that airgun injuries had not made it into your analysis when we're talking about firearms.
I love that you hold me accountable, Christian. I did not include non-powder fire mechanisms, thanks to your excellent paper. All right, thank you.
Thank you again for being an exemplar of courage. This kind of reminds everybody of your next shift in emergency medicine when you go in and we're going to be out of epinephrine or saline or probably nurses. And you get through your shift and do a great job. So thanks again. SAEM24 has officially begun. Thank you all. Enjoy the conference.
Yeah?
I have one. Mine's all questions were
last minute.
Yep.
Yeah. That sounds good. Yeah. See you in the morning. Do we have access to, I need Chris.